going to talk about the armistice and sacred labor in the same video. The armistice and sacred labor are the second and third topics of the theme of artwork, which is the first book of Transcendental Kabbalah. The first theme is the arc, which I already covered, but I will rehearse the basic catechism of the arc briefly. First of all, the arc is a divine energy source. It has nothing to do with emotional satisfaction or gratification or economic gain or optimization. Secondly, so it carries us in that sense. It's a motivating force if we can contact it. Then we carry it. So its existence is fueled by activity in its name, works of genius, whether they are artistic or political or scientific. These are always incomplete and imperfect, and they emanate from the uniqueness of someone's soul. Third, the arc has a flickering, synchronistic quality. It appears as a coincidence. It appears by the grace of God, and it disappears completely. Then it is eternally exterior to the world. It cannot participate in practical gain or allegiance of any kind. It's something different. It's the true vine of Jesus. In that sense of being different from the world, and then also, and this is different, the next point, though it's similar, that it doesn't have a category. So it's neither art nor science nor economics nor politics. It continues over the ages as those categories rise and fall and evolve. So it's something other than any one domain. Now we turn to the second arcanum, the Armistice. So basically an armistice is an eon, an era, a moment, a paradigm, a horizon of intelligibility. First I'll talk about armistices in general, and then I'll talk about the nature of our current armistice. Armistices in general have a subjective component, an objective component, and a contradiction. So the subjective component is a horizon of knowledge, both on an abstract level in terms of theories that only certain people understand, and in terms of a general Overton window of what, say, respectable morality and convention is. It then has an objective aspect, which is basically the world that is created and sustained by the subjective aspect. So you might think that the objective is sort of outside, or that it's like nature or the universe, but that's philosophically naive. The objective world is created by humans, just like the subjective world, but it's created in objective form as matter. So, an obvious example of this is the way that our engineering abilities and our understanding of physics creates like cities and transportation structures and computers and that kind of thing. But there are also objective components to the world that are not material, like buildings. There are things like institutions and laws and social norms and classes, which are immaterial, and also things like money and price and the market. So there's always a tension between the subjective and the objective elements of an armistice, and it's that tension that causes the world to change as new things are discovered, or as problems that are very urgent that need to be solved get solved, or fail to get solved. The world evolves. So again, obvious versions for this of this tend to be industrial, like the way that wars tend to generate, the computer, the atomic bomb, more recently AI, nuclear fusion, and that kind of thing. But it's not just industrial inventions. There are religious developments, like, for example, the rise of Christianity out of paganism and Judaism. And there are, social and artistic developments where where human consciousness is expanding to be to know more, as well as to be more compassionate, more courageous, perhaps. So, as a passage to considering the current armistice in its distinction from previous armistices, and what I have in mind is something like, the Industrial Revolution led to an armistice, and then, say, the revolution in media and mass-mediated consumer culture is another step. These different worlds are created in part because of technological developments. There's no one contradiction that governs a particular armistice. Every armistice is multiple, and there are contradictions, within different domains, and there are even contradictions that don't necessarily map on to any one domain. Maybe like the contradiction between the domains or something like that. So, like in physics, a big contradiction is dark matter. We just don't know what it is. It seems to be called for in the grand unified theory, but like something is not adding up there. And presumably there will be an insight at a certain point that will kind of come in an unexpected way that will explain dark matter, but it might then it might just incorporate it into the current grand unified theory, or it will cause that whole sort of paradigm to be discarded and replaced by a new one, the same way that classical physics was replaced by modern physics with its quantum components and its general relativity, which are also at odds. So that's a contradiction that science deals with as well. I generally use the term the Genesis call for these contradictions, and some philosophers try to really formalize what this contradiction is, using like symbolic logic, perhaps, or whatever. I see no reason to do that, because logic is a restricted domain, and this is philosophy, which is universal. So there are those scientific contradictions. at a theoretical level, and then there are the more practical engineering ones, especially surrounding energy, energy and computation. So, traveling towards nuclear fusion and transcendence of fossil fuels and artificial intelligence. These are very significant things that I have nothing to do with, but they will transform the world. Mapping the human genome, medical advances. There are contradictions in the political sphere. The Genesis calls that concern me the most revolve around gender on the one hand, and creation on the other hand. So one can argue that humanity is in the process of transcending certain gender norms that were perhaps useful or made more sense during earlier modes of production, which didn't make them any less oppressive during those times, but because they were earlier modes of production, it maybe made it more difficult to designate their oppressive quality. So, examining the distinction between gender and biological sex, if there is a gender, if there is a distinction to be made between those, examining the concept of biological sex and the question of whether that concept has built in a distinction between male and female. And there's the question of the origin of gender, the use of gender in society, and the question of whether these concepts at the subjective level can and should evolve, as well as at the objective level, whether the realities, the physical reality of gender or sex is something that can and should evolve. The idea of biological sex being something that might change or evolve, and that possibly being a good thing, is not something that people consider often. So I mention all that. It's something that is present on my mind a lot because I'm transgender. Ultimately, the fact that I'm transgender is a fairly small detail about who I am. I mean, it's not small, but what I care about a lot more in terms of who I am is that I am a philosopher, musician, composer, an artist, and that I participate in those domains. And each of those domains has contradictions, which are productive and which I'm very concerned with. And in all of them, what concerns me most is the contradiction, antinomy, Genesis call, that makes incompatible dogmatic religion on the one hand and materialist modernism and its varieties on the other hand. So, in the psychological domain, the truths of psychoanalysis. In the political domain, the truths of, let's say, Marxism. It's more complicated than that, but of materialist economics or whatever. And in the philosophical domain, positivism and materialism and idealism as sort of various sorts of monism that are they're all dialectical in some way, and they're all different from Christian dogmatism, and they all have insights that were not originally given to Christianity, but they don't supersede it. I'm studying Bulgakov right now, and his work deals with this question in a really detailed way. I'm sort of disappointed that I'm only encountering his work recently. He was writing during mostly like the first half of the 20th century. And in music, there's the antinomy between really the classical tradition and the the countercultural music tradition that we just take for granted as involving pop and rap and rock and metal. The latter being, that's kind of the institutional infrastructure that I'm enmeshed in more. But my music really is classical music too. And so anyway, those are a couple of areas of discussion about the current armistice. There are others I could discuss in more detail, and I think in the Substack post that I made, I talked about totally different stuff, so make sure to check that out. Now we'll pass to the next Arcanum, which is Sacred Labor. And I just wrote the Substack post about this. And I'm not going to cover the whole topic in detail here. I'm just going to casually talk about it. So basically, if the arc is this divine entity that we can make contact with and co-evolve with through a variety of practices, and the armistice is the world that the arc stands opposed to. It's not something that I've perhaps really made clear enough. That the armistice, it has these contradictions that I've been describing, but it's also it's the world, and the arc is outside of the world. So the arc is responsive to and an antidote to the armistice. The arc is supposed to solve the problem of the current armistice to the degree that it can. So define the arc, define the armistice, and then sacred labor is, you might say if the arc is strategy, sacred labor is tactics. Sacred labor is how arc work unfolds in terms of, I guess, how activity in general is transubstantiated into sacred divine activity. Sacred labor, you should think first of all of Marx's concept of labor as humanity's sort of ongoing need and tendency to recreate its conditions of life, which involves things like getting food, as well as governing people, so that they don't harm one another too much. And that that process is something that is just given before any philosophy ever happened. Labor was happening, and so it's sort of a factum, and that's sort of a big part of what the materialist orientation to philosophy is that instead of taking logic or a cosmic principle or a logical principle, or some kind of, instead of taking either God or something logical or mathematical or linguistic as fundamental principles that philosophy sort of has to start with, or it's inconceivable that they're not there because they just seem to be there in your mind as soon as you start thinking. You can't really describe them or ground them, but you have to start from them, because philosophy seems to always find a starting point like that in the case of materialism, the starting point is activity. It's the and in Marxist materialism, it's already kind of theoretized. It's human activity that's sort of economic and productive in general. When you move into more psychoanalytic or phenomenological variants of Marxist materialism, then you begin talking about the reality of desire, or the reality of thrownness, the reality of sort of already being absorbed in a life with situations and other people and concerns, urgent decisions that you need to make, economic realities. So when you might think that when you start thinking, the fundamental thing is, like Descartes was like staring at a candle, and you think you can just push life to the side and start doing pure philosophy, like there's properties and accidents and subjects, or there's the one, there's being, but then that means there's nothingness, or that kind of thing. It's not necessarily a more intelligent choice to focus on those more abstract things. You could push those to the side too, and focus on matter as what is most immediate. And usually matter in this sense has nothing to do with what we think of as matter in scientific contexts, like atoms, or the hardness of the table or something like that. It's matter in terms of action. It's very counterintuitive that it's called matter. I don't really understand how that tradition arose, but so anyway, from this materialist position, I think it's important to distinguish between active labor and passive labor. Active labor being goal-oriented, coordinated, and productive in a distinctly human way that's also kind of computational, and a little bit boring in terms of, it's kind of what you see is what you get, though variety and the unforeseen does come into play, but it has this march forward quality. So that's one aspect of labor or production, which is active. But then there's a passive aspect as well. And passive doesn't mean meek or receptive or, it's not doing anything. It means more like artistic. Passive is seized by passion, and inspired to do things that seem to not make sense yet. And so the work of genius is typically passive rather than active, even though in a way it's supremely active, maybe even more active than a methodical process. And childbirth is an example of this. On the material plane, where a literal child is created as an embryo, and it grows, and the mother is kind of a slave to it in a way, and has to suffer, and really is not deciding how the process is going to go, but she can, she or they, or he, if it's a man with a womb, can make choices that will help the process along, or hurt it, or just have it, cause it to be nuanced in various ways. And then ultimately, there's all this pain involved, and there's this danger, and then there's this agony and ecstasy, and the human childbirth is just one form of birth, and in English that's called labor, and economic work is also called labor. I'm not sure how many other languages share that term for both of those things, but I'm speaking English, so anyway, there's the biological reproduction, but then there's the artistic versions, and intellectual versions, and the scientific versions, and even political, both in the social justice sense of politics, Martin Luther King type of thing, and even just politics in terms of sheer power, just creating institutions, or establishing a horizon of meaning that really reigns, because of wise choices that someone made to establish power. A lot of truth is has its sway because of forms of power that have nothing to do with reason. And going back to politics, even the truth of civil rights stuff, it sort of needs power that transcends the light of reason. So anyway, a lot of that, but parts of it are the methodical dimension of labor. But in terms of establishing a regime of truth, what Lacan calls the master signifier, that is the passive style of childbirth, I would say. But so then there's the question of, when it comes to labor, is there a distinction between the sacred and the profane? A lot of contemporary theology, or 20th century recent theology, modern theology, is concerned with distinguishing between, authentic revelation, authentic goodness, authentic truth that is connected to Christianity, for Christian theologians, which I number myself among between goodness and inspired, enticing, and seemingly maybe productive or prolific phenomena that are evil, even though they aren't. Some things are sort of obviously evil, like if someone's just really, really sick or really frozen or really, really pathological, it's evil. But there's this sort of in-between territory where something is thriving and seems like it perhaps could make a claim on really mattering, that people should care about it and align with it, but it's actually evil. There are certain political movements that are clearly like that, and maybe there are certain artistic movements that are like that are that they're decadent. I'm not really sure what I think about it on the artistic plane, because it's always, in art, it's usually really the decadent movements that they end up becoming dominant in the next generation. But then is there some line? So anyway, so how do you distinguish between sacred labor and profane labor? One part of the answer is simply you look at Christian dogma, as in its broad outline is part of the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed or whatever, and you ask whether the work in question is aligned with that. So this is just kind of a reiteration of the distinction between Christianity and then other forms of religious philosophy that are actually Neoplatonic or Gnostic or Kabbalistic. So I'm very interested in kind of continuing that argument on the side of Christianity. Cyril O'Regan is my big resource in that. I agree with a lot of what he says in his analysis of modern Gnosticism or modern secularism that is sort of a crypto-Gnosticism, but I don't completely agree. I'm more interested in sort of a synthesis, I think, between the Christian message and the fruits of secular culture. And that brings me to the second aspect of the answer to this question, is that there is a the first 7 books or 12 books or something of Balthasar's trilogy is basically about how to distinguish between God's glory and other like fake kinds of glory and false idols. So I refer you to that. But I'm also very interested in materialist versions of the same thing, where these figures like Marx and Deleuze and Guattari's schizoanalysis, Ernst Becker's book The Denial of Death, people who are interested in Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, basically, who they take for granted that religion is a kind of fake morality that is being hypocritically and dishonestly used to bring people down, to crush the individual, to sustain entrenched power, and that kind of thing. Then they use psychoanalysis as well as critique of political economy and science, the scientific understanding of psychology and so forth, to propose a kind of religion, but a materialist one that privileges the individual a bit more. It's a humanist religion the religion of enlightenment. Though there's big distinctions between versions of that, because there's a kind of progressivist version that you might associate with Kant and Hegel, where the world gets more and more civilized and refined in its humanist project. And then there are the more libidinal nihilist versions, like in Nietzsche or Deleuze, that are anti-humanist, and they even take humanist ideals as sacred cows to be discarded. And those really can verge on the evil, but there's the idea where just like extremity in itself can perhaps be salutary, if it awakens people out of their dogmatic slumber. And that's a major theme for French post-structuralism. And basically the thesis is that evil is actually good. And it's similar for Aleister Crowley. And this is continuous with, so much of what I'm involved in, metal and punk. The negativity of punk, the sort of brutality of metal, where it's like, we have no answers, but we know that we're rejecting conformist culture and oppression, and we don't need an answer. The inventiveness and the originality of what we're doing can create some kind of vortex of intensity that we don't know what's on the other side of the wall, but we're just gonna kind of try to barrel through and find out. So that seems like, for the most part, gestures like that have happened enough times that under capitalism, they were once salutary and will kind of were really on the outside of things, but at this point it's almost like it's become part of the internal logic of capitalist culture, and it's a way of distracting people and turning their attention away from their true interests and their ability to really connect to God. Though ironically, in just the past couple of years, that attitude is often associated with a kind of resurrected version of like a twisted Christianity, a reactionary Christianity, which is such a strange nuance, but capital is a very nuanced thing. So, one set of resources comes from Christianity, another comes from materialist critique. One is, one is more compassionate, one is more focused on individual creation. And my closing point here is that I actually think that this synthesis between these extremes is actually not so difficult to achieve at all. There's a very clear answer. There's a very clear and sort of obvious way to synthesize those two traditions of criteria for distinguishing good from evil. And, it pretty much amounts to like progressive Christianity, well-rounded traditionalist education, and sincere concern for existing civil rights movements, as well as possible future ones. Like In other words, the worst, the most pernicious ideological phenomenon in the current time is the uh, is the belief that people seem to have that, like, it's totally inconceivable to solve the problem of the political cultural divide that we're experiencing. You know, it's like it's actually really easy to solve, um, and it just makes sense and it's just better. But there are these strange cultural force fields that prevent people from being able to see that. And so much of what I'm interested in is just sort of pointing out the obvious. So, God is real. Jesus died for our sins. The soul is immortal. Possibly there's more than one material incarnation. But at the same time, individual self-realization is supremely divine. Civil rights politics is supremely divine. Those latter things don't go against God, and God is not against them. They are God.